Entering the Sophia stage is rarely like stepping into a completely new life. It is often more like being at a small party with friends where the music slowly begins to change. At first, almost no one notices. The same people are still in the room. Some are talking in the kitchen. Others are laughing in the living room. A few are still moving gently to the rhythm of the music. And yet, somewhere in the background, something subtle shifts. The song that once carried the whole room begins to change its tone. Some people continue dancing as if nothing happened. Others pause for a moment, slightly unsure of the new rhythm. And a few quietly step away from the dance floor. The strange thing is that nothing dramatic has happened. No argument, no announcement, no sudden disruption. And yet the atmosphere of the room is no longer quite the same. This is often how the Sophia stage begins. From the outside, life may look almost unchanged. The same routines, the same familiar faces moving through your days. But somewhere inside your experience, the emotional rhythm that once connected you to certain dynamics begins to shift. Conversations that once felt natural begin to slow down. Interactions that once felt effortless start to feel slightly distant. And sometimes, without conflict, without any clear ending, someone who was once present in your life simply begins to fade into the background. Not because you pushed them away, not because they suddenly became different, but because something in the rhythm that once connected you quietly changed. For most of life, many interactions operate through subtle forms of reinforcement. Not always intentionally, not always consciously, but quietly. One person shares a frustration and looks for agreement. Someone tells a story and waits for admiration. A friend expresses doubt and hopes for reassurance. These exchanges often feel so natural that they rarely draw attention to themselves. We respond almost automatically. We explain. We comfort. We clarify. We help restore emotional balance. And for many years, this rhythm becomes part of how relationships function. But as the Sophia stage begins to unfold, something subtle starts to change. The situations themselves still appear. People still speak the same way. They still look for the same reactions. But the emotional impulse that once moved you to respond immediately begins to weaken. Not because you are trying to withdraw. Not because you have decided to distance yourself from anyone. But because awareness has quietly entered the exchange. You begin to notice the moment when someone is not really asking a question, but seeking affirmation. You notice when a conversation slowly turns toward validation. You notice when someone is waiting for you to restore a certainty they feel they are losing. And once these patterns become visible, something important begins to shift. The response that once appeared automatically no longer rises with the same urgency. Not because you reject the person, but because the unconscious rhythm that once sustained the exchange has been interrupted. At first, the change may seem almost invisible, but over time, something else begins to happen. Some people start to feel slightly uncomfortable in your presence, not because you have done anything wrong, but because the emotional exchange they were used to receiving is no longer happening in the same way. And when that exchange quietly disappears, the structure of the relationship often begins to loosen as well. Not through confrontation, not through conflict, simply through the absence of the dynamic that once held it together. For some people, this change passes almost unnoticed. But for others, the shift creates a subtle sense that something in the relationship is no longer working in the same way. And as this awareness continues to deepen, another change often begins to appear. You start to notice that many interactions were quietly shaped by roles you had been playing without realizing it. And when those roles begin to loosen, the entire structure of certain relationships can begin to change. One of the first signs of this shift often appears in very ordinary conversations. Nothing dramatic happens. No confrontation. No disagreement. Just a moment that feels slightly different from what it used to be. Someone says something that once would have pulled you immediately into explanation. Perhaps a complaint. Perhaps a subtle criticism. Perhaps a story that quietly invites you to reassure them. In the past, the response might have appeared instantly. You would explain. You would comfort. You would help restore the emotional balance of the moment. But now something pauses. Not resistance, just awareness. You notice the dynamic before you enter it. And because you notice it, your response changes. Sometimes you answer more calmly. Sometimes you say less. Sometimes you simply allow the moment to pass. And it is often in these small pauses that people around you begin to sense the difference. The conversation slows. The other person hesitates, almost as if the familiar rhythm they expected is no longer quite there. It is not uncomfortable, but it is unfamiliar. And for many people, this is the moment when they begin to realize that something inside them has truly begun to change. Before many people begin to understand what is happening psychologically, they often notice something much simpler. A small moment in a conversation. Someone reacts to you in a way that feels strangely familiar, almost predictable. They expect a certain answer, a certain reaction, a certain emotional response that used to appear almost automatically. For years, these exchanges may have felt completely natural. You did not question them. You simply stepped into the role that the moment seemed to require. But now something is different. You notice the expectation before you respond. You notice the emotional pattern behind the words. And once you see it, the interaction begins to look slightly different. Almost as if you are observing the dynamic from the outside while still being part of the conversation. At first, this awareness can feel subtle. But over time it becomes clearer and clearer. The way people relate to you is often shaped by quiet psychological images that formed long ago. And it is only when those images begin to dissolve that the true structure of the relationship becomes visible. As this inner change continues to unfold, many people begin to notice something else shifting quietly in their relationships. It has to do with the way we see other people. Or more precisely, the way we think we see them. For much of life, we rarely meet people exactly as they are. Instead, we meet them through impressions, through expectations, through quiet assumptions that slowly form in the space between two personalities. Carl Jung described this with a simple idea: projection. Sometimes, when we do not fully recognize certain parts of ourselves, we begin to see them reflected in other people. It is a little like looking at someone through tinted glass. The person is real, but the color we see is not entirely theirs. Someone may appear unusually wise to us. Another person may seem especially strong. Someone else may feel strangely difficult, intense, or even threatening. Often, part of what we are seeing belongs not only to them, but to something inside our own psyche that has been placed there without us realizing it. And over time, these impressions can quietly shape entire relationships. These projections often appear in ways that feel completely ordinary. A friend may come to you again and again for advice. At first, it seems like a sign of trust. But over time, you may begin to notice that they are not always looking for guidance. They are looking for certainty. They want you to confirm what they already hope is true. In another situation, a family member may rely on you to calm tensions in every disagreement. Without anyone deciding it consciously, you slowly become the one who restores peace, the stabilizing presence, the one who absorbs the emotional weight of the moment. And sometimes, someone may relate to you through admiration. They expect you to be strong, confident, always clear about what to do. For a long time, these roles can feel natural, even meaningful. But as awareness deepens, something subtle begins to shift. You begin to see that these expectations are not always about who you truly are. They are about the psychological image that formed between you. And when that image begins to dissolve, the interaction itself begins to change. Not because anyone intended it, but because the role that once held the dynamic together is no longer being played in the same way. For some relationships, this shift brings more honesty. Both people gradually begin to meet each other more naturally. But in other cases, the connection becomes uncertain, because the image that once organized the relationship is no longer there. And once that happens, another experience often begins to appear. Not outside of you at first, but inside, a quiet and unexpected sense of guilt. As certain relationships begin to change, many people experience something they do not expect. Not relief, not clarity, at least not at first. What often appears first is guilt, a quiet feeling that maybe you should be doing more, explaining more, trying harder to keep the relationship the way it used to be. For a long time, many people learned to believe that being a good person meant keeping every relationship stable, being understanding, being available, being the one who helps things work again when tension appears. So when a connection begins to loosen, the first instinct is often to assume something is wrong with you. Maybe you have become distant. Maybe you are being too quiet. Maybe you should try harder to fix the situation. But in many cases, something else is actually happening. You are simply no longer reacting in the same automatic way you once did. The roles you once stepped into without noticing are no longer appearing so easily. And when that happens, the relationship can feel unfamiliar. Because for a long time, the connection may have depended on you restoring the balance of the interaction, calming tension, clarifying misunderstandings, reassuring the other person. When you stop doing that automatically, the dynamic changes. And that change can create guilt. Not because you have done something wrong, but because you are no longer carrying the same emotional responsibility you once carried in the relationship. Many people confuse this moment. They think the connection is weakening because they care less. But often the opposite is true. You may still care about the person. You may still wish them well. What is changing is simply the role you once played in holding the relationship together. And once that role begins to disappear, another realization often follows. The people who slowly begin to fade are rarely random. They are usually connected to the very dynamics that are no longer operating in the same way. For many people, the realization does not happen all at once. It often appears in a quiet moment. You remember a friend from college, someone you once saw almost every day. You studied together, shared frustrations about exams, spent long afternoons talking about life, plans, and the future. For years, that person was simply part of your routine. And then one day, you notice something strange. You cannot remember the last real conversation you had. Life simply moved forward. Weeks passed, maybe months. Nothing dramatic happened. No argument. No clear ending. The connection simply became distant. At first, this can feel confusing, almost as if something important quietly disappeared without explanation. But when you look closer, you begin to notice something interesting. The distance did not appear randomly. It appeared in relationships that once depended on certain emotional patterns. Others were used to influencing conversations in subtle ways. And some relationships were sustained by dynamics that only worked as long as certain emotional reactions were present. As awareness grows, these patterns become easier to recognize. And once they are seen clearly, it becomes difficult to continue participating in them in the same way as before. For example, individuals with strong narcissistic tendencies often rely on a steady flow of attention and emotional validation. Manipulative personalities, on the other hand, tend to depend on confusion, reaction, or subtle pressure to maintain influence within a relationship. When awareness deepens, these patterns begin to lose the environment they once depended on. Conversations change. Reactions become calmer. certain emotional triggers simply stop producing the same response. And when the dynamic shifts in this way, some relationships begin to lose the structure that once sustained them. Not because anyone decided to end the connection, but because the interaction no longer follows the same psychological rhythm it once did. Over time, many people begin to recognize something that initially seemed confusing. The distance that appeared in certain relationships was not always a loss. Often, it was a form of quiet reorganization. Because as awareness deepens, the social world around you begins to reorganize itself. Some people remain close. Others slowly drift into the background of your life. And quite often, the ones who fade away are the very dynamics that once kept you tied to patterns you no longer need to carry. When many people first reach this realization, the feeling can be surprisingly mixed. Part of you may feel relief. Relief that the constant emotional effort is no longer required. But another part of you may feel a quiet sadness. Not because the relationship was meaningless, but because it belonged to an earlier moment of your life, a different stage of who you were becoming. And recognizing this can bring a deeper kind of understanding. Some relationships were not meant to last forever. They were meant to accompany you through a particular chapter. And once that chapter changes, the relationship sometimes changes with it, not as a failure, but simply as part of the movement of life itself. Sometimes the distance appears in a quieter way, when the other person simply does not quite recognize the role you once played in the relationship. For years, they may have known you in a very specific way. The one who always explained things. The one who restored calm when tension appeared. The one who reassured them when uncertainty returned. When that role slowly disappears, the interaction can begin to feel unfamiliar, almost as if the relationship itself is searching for the version of you it once knew. Some people adjust to that change. They begin relating to you in a new way. But others remain connected to the older rhythm of the interaction. And when the relationship cannot reorganize itself around the new reality, the distance gradually grows. Not because anyone decided to create that distance, but because the connection was built around a role that no longer exists in quite the same form. For many people, the deeper realization of this stage does not appear immediately. It becomes clearer only after some time has passed. You begin to notice that the social landscape around you feels different. Not empty, just quieter. Some conversations that once filled your days are no longer there. Some emotional tensions that once required constant attention have simply disappeared. At first, this silence can feel unusual. For years, you may have been used to navigating complex emotional dynamics in almost every direction. Explaining, clarifying, trying to keep certain relationships stable. When those dynamics fade, the absence they leave behind can feel almost strange. But gradually something else becomes visible. The relationships that remain begin to feel lighter, more direct, more balanced. Conversations no longer require the same level of emotional management. You do not have to explain yourself as often. You do not have to restore the emotional balance of every interaction. And over time, many people realize that the quietness they first noticed was not emptiness. It was simply the absence of patterns that once demanded constant attention. One of the strangest things about this stage is that the changes are not only about who leaves. They are also about the space that appears afterward. When certain dynamics disappear, something unexpected often follows. There is simply more room. Room for quieter conversations. Room for relationships that do not require constant emotional management. Room for people who are comfortable meeting you without roles, without pressure, without invisible expectations. At first, this space can feel unfamiliar, because for a long time, Much of your energy may have been occupied maintaining certain emotional patterns in relationships, explaining, calming, adjusting, trying to keep the connection stable. When those patterns disappear, the silence they leave behind can feel almost strange. But over time, something else begins to enter that space. Different kinds of connections. People who do not need you to be the stabilizer. People who do not expect constant reassurance. People who are simply comfortable meeting you where you are. The conversations feel easier. The interactions feel lighter. Not because the relationships are shallow, but because they no longer depend on unconscious patterns to survive. Carl Jung often described individuation as a process that reorganizes the entire psychological landscape of a person's life. And that landscape includes the people who walk beside us. Some relationships belong to earlier chapters. Others begin to appear when those chapters close, which is why many people eventually discover something surprising about this phase of inner change. When certain people leave, the story is not ending. It is simply making room for different kinds of connections to enter. And when you look back after some time has passed, the pattern often becomes clear. The space that once felt empty was never truly empty. It was simply waiting for relationships that could exist without the patterns you no longer needed to carry. In many ways, the process resembles the gathering we imagined at the beginning. The room is still there. The same people may still move through the space. But the music has changed. Some continue dancing to the rhythm they already know. Others pause, uncertain about the new tone that has entered the room. And a few remain comfortably present, moving naturally with the new rhythm that has emerged. The gathering itself has not disappeared, but the atmosphere within it has quietly transformed. And those who remain are often the ones who can move freely within that new emotional space. And that is one of the quiet truths many people eventually understand about the Sophia Stage. Not everyone stays. And slowly, a different kind of circle begins to form around you. But the ones who arrive often belong much more naturally to who you have become. And if this experience feels familiar to you, it may help to understand what is actually shifting beneath the surface during this stage. Because the changes we talked about today, the distance in certain relationships, the fading of old dynamics, are only part of a deeper process happening inside the psyche. In other video of this series, we explored that inner transformation in much more detail. If you want to understand why these shifts happen, not only in your relationships, but within your own inner world, I invite you to watch that video next. It will help connect many of the experiences we discussed today.